Have you ever wondered why the church thing at large just feels so cliche? Here's why I think you should stop going to church. What's up, One Life? Listen, pretty happy, pretty proud of this moment because this is kind of our first as a team, as a One Life Henderson. It's the first time we've built a series, or maybe we've attempted to. You never know how it's going to work out. However, I do know that we're pretty excited about where we are, and we're pretty excited about what we're doing because I believe that it matters. And the reality is we have this series. It's called Stop Going to Church, Made for More. It's kind of this whole play on words, if you will. However, we've all been in a place to where, church in and of itself has been a little bit disillusioning, disenchanting, however you want to say it. I think if you've been in church any time, or even if you've watched it from the outside, it comes across as this thing that's just kind of hard to deal with, or you don't know what to do with. And so, I remember growing up in a Baptist church. I grew up as a Southern Baptist here in Henderson, Kentucky, and I grew up with this perception, like we always went to church. My family was always at church. I've told this at our church several times, my story, but every time the doors were open, my family was there and we were serving and doing stuff. And so, but what I also saw was at home, like my grandparents lived in our house, and I remember coming downstairs and seeing in the kitchen, and my grandfather would be on the right side of the table and my grandmother would be on the left side of the table. And what they were doing was they had their Bibles open and they were reading their Bibles at the kitchen table in the mornings. I remember, my dad, because he got up early for work, would stay up a little bit later. And I remember coming down the stairs at night or coming in late from being with my friends, and my dad would be reading his Bible, sitting in his chair, what he still does to this day. So I had this whole thing in my mind of what it was and what this life, this walk with Jesus kind of meant. But I think there was an assumption inside my head that every family looked like mine. I felt like there was an assumption in my brain that everybody around me at church kind of had the same reality that I did. You see, our family wasn't sin-free. We didn't have any issues. We didn't have any lack of issues, I guess I should say. We have our issues. We had our issues. But you go to church, and it seems like I would go there, and everybody would be great. Like my grandmother, all the grandmothers, right, and mothers loved it when their kids dressed nice. And I wore my little bow tie when I was younger, and I would wear jeans with a belt and tucked in shirt, a button-up shirt. My grandmother really liked it when I looked that way. So we'd go there and everything would be put together and we'd sing the songs, and it was, a mob-specific area where I grew up. It was a particular lack of energy, I think, in our response, like in our worship time of worship music. And then there was the messages, which I'm sure were great messages, incredible. I don't know that I remember a lot of those messages. I do remember some from Wednesday nights when I was in my youth group and I was hearing all those messages. They were kind of relatable. But I do remember that Sunday mornings were largely unrelatable to me. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't even really know what they were saying. Like so much so that as I reflect on that, I'm left with this interesting question. Why go to church? Why go to church? And I think it's a justified question. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, right? First of all, if I'm being honest with you, I don't want you to stop attending church, right? Here's what I want us to stop doing. I want you and I want myself, I want us all, if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, to stop going to church as though that's the goal of a follower of Jesus. Because we're made for more. Let me say that one more time. I want you to stop going to church as if that's the culmination, that's the big primary reason why you stepped into being a follower of Jesus. Because you were made for more. So I want you to attend church. I want you to give to your church. I want you to serve at your church. But we have to be reminded, what's the intent? What's the purpose of the church? And what's your role to play in that? And this whole series is going to embark on that journey, at least to a degree. Probably not exhaustively, because we only have 7 weeks, and there's a whole lot of ground to cover as it pertains to the church of Jesus Christ. It's so much more dynamic, I think, than I could even know this side of heaven. However, I think I do want to touch on a few things. And first and foremost today, I want us to look at you and I and what the kind of church is kind of supposed to look like. Like, what are we supposed to look like? And so here's my big idea of the day. And if you're watching this, I want you to type this in the comments. Like, you're going to type that. I want you to type this in the comments. And I'll say it once fast, and I'll repeat it if I need to. The church is a people of the gospel of Jesus. The church is a people of the gospel of Jesus. Couple things on there. That's super cliche. I know it. Like you were, oh man, imagine that. I'm listening to a sermon and he says the gospel of Jesus. And here's the problem with that. Where I'm from, I don't know where you're from, but where I'm from, it's almost all cliche. Like everything about church feels very much cliche and done before and overdone and overused and overpromised and underdelivered. It just feels very much cliche. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to acknowledge the gospel, this phrase and what it is. If we're going to be a people of the gospel of Jesus, what does that even mean? And I think the first thing that we need to understand out of the box is that the gospel is not, the phrase, the gospel, in the Greek it says the euangelion, is not unique to Christianity. I'm going to say that again. The phrase, the gospel, is not unique to Christianity. Gospel simply translates, or euangelion simply translates as good news. And in the ancient world, there was good news everywhere depending on who you were. So let's just say that maybe Caesar Augustus attacks Persia and they go and they win. Like after they win that battle, they win that war, what they're going to do is they're going to send out the good news of the euangelion that Caesar won the war. This would be good news to them. Now, not so much to the Persians, right? But for them, it would be, here's the gospel. Here's the good news of the fact that we won the war. Like we declare things, or the gospel, that's essentially what it was, and that's how it was used. Now, what makes it distinctly Christian is the fact that it says the gospel of Jesus Christ, or the gospel of Jesus, and who he is. So the person and work of Jesus shapes what the good news actually is. And so if we're going to be the people of the gospel, I think it's important that we understand exactly what that means as well. Now, I'm not going to do all that work, a lot of work on that phrase euangelion or any of that. Highly recommend that you find some resources on that. I know the Bible Project will talk about things. That's a great asset for you. It's a great resource for us to go and learn. And you can find some of those. There's plenty more of that out there, and we'll throw some of those in the comments. However, I think it can help shape and inform. So we got to understand first and foremost that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, as they say that word, gospel, euangelion, it wouldn't have been foreign to the people that this Bible was written to, or this passage that we're going to deal with today is written to. Secondly is this. I will always remind you that the Bible is not about you. It's not about me. It's about Jesus. Right? Or it's about Jesus, and it displays the nature and character of God. And it was not written to you, and it was not written to me, and it was not written to our culture. It was written to an ancient culture, so that we're forced in that moment, once we realize that, to figure out what the original people would have heard so that we can know how to apply it today. So we're going to be looking at this book, 2 Corinthians. It's in the New Testament. Corinth is a city in the ancient world. And there's actually, since this is 2 Corinthians, there's a 1 Corinthians. And the 1 Corinthians, really cool thing. It's a really cool book. It's a good book. But Paul's the author of both of these books. And he was writing into Corinth, this church in Corinth, for very specific reasons. He was responding to different things. And Paul was this church planter guy in the ancient world. Again, the Bible Project will walk you through 1 and 2 Corinthians much more than I have time for now. But there's this guy named Paul who had this encounter with Jesus that changed everything about him in beautiful ways, and he goes off planting these churches all over the ancient world. And when he's doing that, I think that there's a lot to be said about it. In fact, if you have been following with us along through our 167 journals, then what you know is that we've been combing through all these letters in the books, and where's the corresponding scriptures in the book of Acts and all those things, where that all can be. So if you don't have that and you're in Henderson, get it. In fact, if you don't have that and you're watching this and you want one, maybe we can try to get you one somehow, some way. We'd love to do that because it's important for us to understand what happened. So Corinth is this big city. It's a port city, like high levels of economic impact in the ancient world, would have been a melting pot of demographics, would have been different races, would have been different religions. In fact, we know that there are temples around there to other gods that Paul writes to the church in Corinth talking about people in the church that are going to eat food from those temples and they're going and worshiping at those temples. So he's dealing with all these factors and these realities in this first book especially. And so now, these aren't the only two letters, by the way, and there's an actual cool resource by a guy named Tim Mackey. It's called the 5-Minute Bible, and so he just takes like 5 minutes and he combs through some different books of the Bible, highlights what they know, and if you can find the one on 2 Corinthians, it's a really cool thing. I watched it a little bit yesterday. But in 2 Corinthians, it's not just the second letter that Paul wrote. Paul wrote like 4 to them, and so the two in between 1st and 2 Corinthians would have been a little bit, maybe Paul was a little bit aggressive sometimes. That's fair. And so he was saying some kind of harsh things. He references it in this book and all that stuff. But 1st and 2 Corinthians essentially are letters of response from Paul, what he's hearing about this church. And how can he write into it? And so 2 Corinthians, we're going to be in chapter 5, living in chapter 5. And what I want to do is I want to do a couple things. I want you to understand that Paul would have been writing into a scene, would have been writing into a scenario of multiple religious beliefs, multiple interactions with other religious beliefs for the Christians. He would have had the Jewish people there as well. That would have created some tension. And then would have people that kind of dabbled in all three of those, and then that would have created some even more tension. And so Paul's writing into this thing, trying to help these followers of Jesus understand what it is that they signed up for and why they're there and how they're there. And so I'm going to read through this passage, and I'm going to read in 2 Corinthians 5. I'm going to start in verse 16 and go to 21. Now, if you were live with us on Sunday, we'll be starting in verse 11, but this is a little bit more condensed version for that. But I'm going to start in verse 16 so that we can kind of get these 3 ideas that Paul's getting at in this passage. So starting in 16, he says, "So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation." That's number 1. He is a new creation. "The old is gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. And we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us." I love that line. So he says this, "Be reconciled to God. God made him," talking about Jesus, "who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." So there's 3 big ideas with one overarching idea, right? So the first thing is this new creation. He says it in verse 17, "If anyone is in Christ, you're a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come." So there's this weird, odd thing there that kind of goes against me, because here's what I know, is I know that people just don't change. So what I know about that is I ran into a guy that I went to high school with, and actually I wasn't ran into him. I ran into him online, right, on social media. So that's kind of a cool thing. But anyways, I saw this post that he had put. And I'm not going to tell you what the post was because it wasn't exactly appropriate. But in that post, here's what I know, is that it let me understand that that guy is the same person today, and I remember the same struggles, with the same challenges, with the same issues, or what I perceive to be issues, that he wrestled with back in high school. And the only reason I know that is because he and I may or may not have gotten in a little bit of trouble together. And so there's this thing about things that change. And here's the other thing I know. When I'm married, if you're married or you're in a significant relationship and you've been there for a while, you know that the struggle's real. The struggles are the same. The challenges are the same. People don't necessarily change. It's kind of hard. So this can be something that kind of pushes back against me, because everything in my life tells me that people don't really change. And especially when I look at people that claim to be followers of Jesus. Like, there's kind of some weird tension there for me. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge, number 1. But number 2, I also think it's important for us to remember that the new creation aspect of this is much more rooted in the resurrection of Jesus than it is for us changing our behaviors. And here's what I mean by that, is that anytime that we're trying to change and do something differently, we almost always use these external observations or our comparisons to other people to chart our course for change. So, if I want to be, more fit or do more fitness, then I'm going to find somebody who's fit. I'm going to pattern my life after them, and hopefully I can do that. And that lasts for about 15 minutes every January. And then I go back to eating cupcakes and French fries and cheeseburgers and all that stuff, right? And so that's kind of how this whole thing works. It's what we do. But what Paul's getting at is when he says that the old is gone and the new has come, he's referencing this new creation concept that looks at the Old Testament. It looks at the Old Testament, and in the Old Testament, then when they use that phrase, they're talking about kind of the end times. They're talking about what happens in the end. They're talking about the afterlife. And so almost every commentator I've read has said that when Paul says that there's a new creation, that the old is gone and the new is here, they're saying that that's grounded, that's a language that's grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. And they say it's really hard for us to see in our language, in the English language, because it's just so weird. However, what we know to be true is that every time I try to become new or set forth a new me or bring out be a new person, I almost always fall short. Anytime I want to be better husband or I want to be a better this and that, I almost always fall short. Because in order for us to really change and really be a new creation, it has to come out of the resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And more on that in just a second. So the second big idea is reconciliation. And he says, all this is from God. So talking about the new creation, the old is gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting men's sins against them. And the reason that he uses that word reconciliation is that's kind of an accounting term. It's a finance term in the Greek. They use it a lot, talking about reconciling accounts, reconciling debts, making all that stuff line up and make it work. Well, Paul brings up this idea of God's reconciling all humanity, all of reality to himself, and he's not counting our sins against us. Right? So let's think about this for a second. So we're a new creation, and God has made us not just reconciled us to him, but made us ministers of that same reconciliation. So all of our debts are squared. We're good to go. God don't necessarily owe you anything. It's not that. He doesn't hold us accountable to the debts that we've created in him. Because we are viewed now through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. You see, it's important when we're reading Paul. He almost always comes back to the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And he filters everything through that. And the third big idea is he says that we are now ambassadors. He says we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, right? So remember, therefore, we need to go, if you see that word, we need to look back up above it, and he's talking about new creation, and we're ministers of reconciliation. Therefore, we have received reconciliation. Therefore, we are Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal to humanity. I'm adding that, by the way, through us. And this is the big ticket item that I think that we've missed in the church, is that because we've viewed our following Jesus, and as we're looking at it like we're indebted to God, that now that we're followers of Jesus, we have to go to church on Sundays, and we have to do X, Y, Z, and we have to show up, and we have to serve, and we have to show up, and we got to give, and we have to do all these things. It's just not that. It's quite simple. It says not that. He says our ambassadorship, he goes, no, I've brought you to new life. I've reconciled you. I've reconciled all of your debts in such a way. Now, here's the cool thing. Now, you're ambassador for me. So that means you walk around this life, you walk around this earth, you go to work, you go to the gym, you go to restaurants, and you interact with servers, and you interact with people, and you interact with other Christians and non-Christians, and you interact on social, and you interact on YouTube, and you have your YouTube channels, and you have all these things, and we're called to be ambassadors for Jesus. Now, he talks about this in chapter 4, and he says that when he's talking about the same concept, like the reconciliation, and we're ministers of this reconciliation, he says this, he goes, but we have this treasure, talking about Jesus, the resurrection, in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. Guys, this is not militant language. It's not militant language. This is language that says, listen, because we are, as he says in chapter 2, the aroma of Christ to people that are followers of Jesus and to people that are not, then we can teach and show them how to interact with every emotion that we're going to feel in this world. And you might be struck down, but you know what? Because your newness, your new life in Jesus, your reconciliation is filtered through the resurrection. You're not destroyed. You might be perplexed. You might not have a clue what's going on around you or what's happening, but you will not be in despair because your life is filtered through the resurrection of Jesus. And that's the big idea. And here's what I want you to imagine as I wrap up. I want you to imagine with me, if every single person that calls himself a follower of Jesus, understanding that we're going to fail sometimes, but knowing that every single follower of Jesus, and we can even start with just our church, but if you don't go to our church, your church, I want you to imagine every single person commit to being what Paul calls the aroma, or being an ambassador to everybody around us about the goodness of God, about the beauty of God, about the hope that we can find in suffering. I want you to imagine what this world looks like, what people's lives look like, and how they're impacted for the good because of followers of Jesus, being the church, being people of the gospel of Jesus Christ that says we might be struck down, but we're not destroyed because of the resurrection of Jesus. I might be confused and have no idea what's happening around me or why it's happening. I'm not going to be in despair because there's hope in the resurrection of Jesus. So as we navigate the rest of this series, we're going to talk about these three kind of concepts, flesh them all out, and talk about how we can interact with people and we can interact as the church. What's our overarching purpose, and how do we get the most out of every opportunity that God's put in front of us every single day of our life?